Welcome. Welcome back to History in Galveston. Welcome back to the group that is bringing the history of Juneteenth and the historic places that exist in Galveston, Texas. This is being brought to you by the Galveston Island African American Treasure Group. We are excited today, just excited today, because when we talk about history, we talk about who we are, why we are, and what we are about. And so today, one of the historic places that we're going to discuss is Reedy Chapel, African American. Always say that because I'm talking about African Americans so much, but it is the Reedy Chapel, African Methodist Episcopal Church, and it is the mother church of Methodism in Texas. And today we're going to have a young lady that her passion is genealogy. She is a BOI. You know, I keep telling you that everybody needs to understand that Galveston is an island, 3 miles wide at its widest point, 32 miles long. So today, Sharon, I'm going to ask you some questions or talk to you about Reedy Chapel AME Church.
Well, thank you for having me, Cornelia.
And you know what, everybody, when I say it's her passion, she's a genealogist, and anything that you want to know how to find out about your past or the development of the past, bringing something that all of our families need to look into. I think one of our guests said previously that in our houses we have information, and each one of us needs to start now to take the time and understand our families and where we are from and Galveston, Texas.
I would definitely agree with that because history starts in your home, in your family. You really can't study the history of a place without studying the families who live there. You can't study the families without knowing the soil in which they were born and which they lived. I like to make analogies between plants and families because if a plant is growing in bad soil, its development is stunted. But if a plant is growing in rich soil, its development is fruitful. And that's the same thing for families. If families are living in an environment that is supportive, then their families will thrive. If the families are growing in a place where their existence is opposed, then they will have a struggle for the whole time. And so if you want to know about history, start with your own family. The history is there. Talk to your elders and look around your house and find the artifacts and the documents that represent the life that your family lived in the place where they lived.
I understand you also teach genealogy on the island.
I do. I teach it in many places, genealogy institutes across the country. And I teach strategies and methodologies that African Americans and others can use to research African American families, because it's not just African Americans who are researching African American families. Now that our history has become more mainstream, we have other genealogists from other ethnicities who are hiring themselves out as genealogists, and they need to know the specific methodologies and strategies that are effective in researching African American families. And so that's what I teach.
Wow. I did some research myself when I lived in Los Angeles.
Okay.
I went to the Mormons temple.
Yes.
And went through my genealogy and got all the way back to Virginia. Haven't gotten across the water yet.
Well, all roads lead to Virginia.
Yes. And so I'm excited, and I'm going to try to get on to one of your classes to continue doing the research. But that brings me to mind that I know you are a member of Reedy Chapel.
Yes.
AME Church. And I know that you have brought to us a lot of history that many of us who have been there since we were children were able to be excited about. And one of the ones that comes to mind with Juneteenth has to do with the celebration, the first celebration of Juneteenth. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So, of course, we know that on June 19th, 1865, Union soldiers under the command of General Gordon Granger came to Galveston to enforce emancipation for enslaved people. I did not say inform, I said enforce. And I said that word intentionally because, of course, everybody in Galveston, including enslaved people, already knew that the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed and became effective on January 1st, 1863. That's fully 2.5 years after the Union soldiers finally got there to say, the game is over, Confederates, give it up. These people are free. Let them go. And so when they came, they arrived at the docks and they sneaked in over the railroad bridge in Galveston to surprise the Union forces in the harbor. And at that point, the Confederates took back control in 1863. But then the government came in to enforce it in 1865, and they, ousted the Confederates, and black people were then free. One of the first, or the first, celebration of emancipation that we've been able to document is a celebration that took place on January 1st, 1866. And that celebration included a march from the old Galveston courthouse to the colored church on Broadway. That colored church on Broadway became Reedy Chapel, African Methodist Episcopal Church. Well, people will say, well, why did this happen on January 1st, 1866? It's because January 1st was the effective date of the Emancipation Proclamation. And this January 1st was the first opportunity that freedmen now had to celebrate their emancipation. So they celebrated on the effective date of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was January 1st, 1863. And we know this because I found documentation of it in the newspapers of the day. It was advertised in the paper, in the Flakes Daily Bulletin on December 31st, 1865, that there would be a celebration of emancipation on the next day, which would be January 1st, 1866. And I loved the fact that I was able to find documentation of this, because people will say, well, how do you know that? I know it because I have documentation of it. I have the advertisement that was in the paper. And then on the day after the celebration, there was a description of exactly what happened at that celebration. And of course, it included numbers, which was totally revealing to me. 800 to 1,000 people in 1866 assembled at the Galveston courthouse, the old Galveston courthouse, which they call the Central Square, and they processioned to the site of Reedy Chapel AME Church, and they had a program inside the church at that point that included inspirational speakers, prayers, music, and that is exactly what we do today in order to honor that history of Reedy Chapel. We reenact that celebration of emancipation. So it was a long time before the celebration of emancipation became known as Juneteenth. That evolved over time. In the beginning, it was Emancipation Day.
Wow. Wouldn't you say in Galveston, to let our audience know that the authentic celebration of emancipation and Juneteenth is in Galveston, Texas, and that you can find a lot of information at our library, Rosenberg Library on the 3rd floor? Is that what it is?
It's on the 4th floor, and it's the Galveston and Texas History Center. But you don't even have to be in Galveston to access some of this information. There are newspaper databases that you can access from your desktop if you have a library card. And, of course, you can find out more if you go to the library. But there's a lot of information that you can access at home from your computer. But Galveston is the home of Juneteenth. It's where it started. We are celebrating the day that Union forces came to Galveston to enforce emancipation. What took them so long to get there? There's all kind of legends. Well, the man got killed on the horse who was on his way. They didn't come by horse. Or they kept him so that they could get another cotton plantation crop out. That's plausible. But the real reason is that Texas was on the western frontier. There were not a lot of battles fought here. The last battle fought here in Galveston was the Battle of Galveston. That was on January 1st, 1863, which was the effective date of emancipation. So I don't think that was an accident. I think that was like a little dig. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the Confederates took control at that time, and that's why Union soldiers had to come here and enforce it. It took them a while to get here, and in the meantime, the people of Galveston who were slave holders just did not adhere to that. You know how Texas is. They said, hey, we could go back to being the Republic of Texas. We don't have to be in the unions. But, that's not the truth. And so when the soldiers came here to enforce emancipation, they just laid down their arms. There was no battle. The Confederates just said, oh, yeah, we know the gig is up. But one of the most powerful images of their arrival was that there were thousands of United States colored troops. Most people don't know that. And if you can think of how it must have looked to black and white people alike to see black men in uniform with guns at a time when the only black people they had ever seen were enslaved, that must have been a shock and a joy. Shock for some, revelation and joy for others.
Sounds good. Many people call Galveston during this time to try to validate things that have happened. And one of the issues that recently I've heard is about when they did celebrate, were they allowed to go in the parks to celebrate? As we came up as children, our families celebrated Juneteenth. And I think Faye Williams was telling us that, at the time it was still as such they could not celebrate because it was still segregated, the parks. and that they went out in the different counties and began to celebrate?
Well, I think that would likely be true. The challenge of documenting that is that our history and our affairs were not documented, regularly documented. And so we have to rely on family stories of our elders like Miss Fay, and who has great memories of her ancestors here in Galveston, generations in Galveston. So we have to rely on that. But I do have documentation of some celebrations that occurred in Galveston. In fact, one in the 1880s talked about a parade that was on Market Street, and Market from about 26 to 20 to 26th going west. And that would have been the African American Business District, where your doctors and your dentists were located. And it was at that celebration that I found documentation of that Hawkins Wilson was a speaker. He was the orator of the day. And for those who may not have heard of Hawkins Wilson, he was he was famous because he wrote a letter during the time of when the Freedmen's Bureau was in Galveston in 1867. He wrote a letter from Galveston to the Freedmen's Bureau in Virginia. And in the letter, he lays out all of his memories of his whole entire family and all of the plantation owners that he could remember. And he was a child, but he has these accurate memories of the names of his sisters, his mother, who their owners were, where they lived. And so this letter to the Freedmen's Bureau became a famous letter. And it's significant for Reedy Chapel because in the last line of the letter, he says, "Write to me as soon as you can." He's telling this to his sister. "Write to me as soon as you can. If you get this letter, write to me in care of the Colored Methodist Church in Galveston." That's Reedy Chapel.
Wow.
And so Reedy Chapel has been in the forefront of this celebration of emancipation since it happened, since the very first celebration of emancipation. And in fact, we have lore. I call it lore or family stories that when the soldiers came, they nailed General Order Number 3, which said all slaves are free, to the front door of the church at that time. Now, we have no documentation of that, but it is a persistent story. And when there's a persistent story from multiple sources like that, there's a thread of truth in it. We may not be able to ever document it because there was no record left as the soldiers went through the city to give this news to the African American community. But Reedy Chapel was the closest church to where they headquartered, which was on the Strand. It's the closest church, so it makes perfect sense. And the fact that the first celebration of emancipation was held there was some recognition that this church, the Colored Methodist Church South, was the place to get in touch with African Americans in this city.
Many persons of that time, like Norris Wright Cuny, have been members of that church during that time.
Absolutely right. The church rolls are full of people who have had a tremendous commitment to the political, labor, education, music, history of this entire area, including your family, the Skull family, the Fedfords, Norris Wright Cuny, Thomas Warren, who was a principal here, mm-hmm. J.R. Gibson. These people were associated with Reedy Chapel and as members. And so we can be proud of the history of Reedy not only for its role in emancipation, but after emancipation and going forward. In fact, one of the first freedmen's schools was established at Reedy Chapel. Now, when the Freedmen's Bureau got there, they went first to establish a school at Avenue L Baptist Church, which of course was the first Baptist church in Texas. Then they came a couple of days later to Reedy Chapel, and they were there for the purpose of establishing a church, but they found that there was establishing a school, but they found that there was already a school operating there. And it was being operated by a lady named Mrs. Wren. This is documented. And so the first school in Galveston was at Reedy Chapel.
Just so much history.
Just so much history.
So
much history. And it's there for us to find. We can't depend on them to tell it. We have to be the ones to go and find our own history and make sure that our children know, and our generations coming behind us, our descendants, know that is our history. And that's why our celebration is so important today, is because we are celebrating, but we're also educating.
Yes.
We're celebrating and educating at the same time. And I think that distinguishes the celebration at Reedy Chapel from all the other wonderful, wonderful celebrations that are going on in Galveston.
Now, how do you think, before I ask that, I wanted to ask about the Freedmen Bureau. When you, those persons who are looking for information, can you tell them where? I know there's one in Houston.
No, the Freedmen's Bureau no longer exists. The Freedmen's Bureau existed from right after the Civil War, 1866 to 1872. This was the era called Reconstruction. It could have been the era when America said, let's do things differently.
Yes.
But of course, we know that once they saw things being done differently, and they saw people like Norris Wright Cuney becoming legislators, they said, oh, no, we can't take this. And then that's when they implemented all those restrictive and horrible, oppressive Jim Crow laws and things to suppress it. But the Freedmen's Bureau was throughout the 16 Southern Confederate states for the purpose of assisting newly freed people to establish their lives. They established marriages. They didn't have to establish marriages. They basically allowed people who were already married to have it legalized. And they established schools. They also provided relief to people. And it wasn't just for the freedmen, because the name of the organization was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. So the refugees were white, but they were broke. They had gone through this terrible war, 500,000 people killed in the war, and they too were destitute. They just didn't get oppressed after that. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was put in place in these 16 states to assist the freedmen and the refugees and to reestablish the economic industry, agricultural industry, to bring the country back to a solvency.
Is there any indication once the slaves were free in Galveston, how life was for African Americans in Galveston?
No, I really haven't. I really can't tell you any specifics about that. But in the beginning, I think that it was going to be difficult for them, because even though they were there the Freedmen's Bureau was there to provide some assistance, these people did not have any money. They didn't have any, most of them did not have the ability to read and write. They were living in a hostile environment for sure, and they had to start on their own. They did not have land. Many of them ended up being sharecroppers in areas where there were plantations, but here they probably ended up just continuing to work either on the waterfront or for families. And if you read General Order Number 3, it says all slaves are free by executive order, but it also tells them, and the freedmen are advised to stay where they are,
Yes,
and work for wages. Well, you know, they were going to cry po mouth. They're not going to start paying wages at this point, and they hadn't been all along. So that would have been a difficult thing to get them to pay wages. And so it's almost like one hand and then the other hand contradicted each other. You're free, but don't go nowhere. Stay where you are. And so life could not change immediately for many of them. Now, some people freed themselves on foot. They just left and sought a better life in other places. But if you've got a family, that's a hard decision to make. So I would think that younger people, more adventurous people, did hit it and leave. And in fact, a lot of them did go to places like Houston and start Freedmen's Town and Emancipation Park, where they started Emancipation Park for the reason of being able to celebrate their own emancipation in a place where they would be welcome.
right. And I think now that we have folk who are writing a lot about what happened, I think at the first sign of emancipation being a legal holiday, that we started talking about how the folk were freed and just moved forward up 45. That's the, highway up to Houston and different areas in between there, like Brazoria and so forth, in the different counties. But we in Galveston really want the public, the nation, to understand that Galveston is where it first started. And so many firsts. As you said, there were quite a few historical churches that all denominations started.
Holy Rosary,
Yes.
Catholic Church, Avenue L Baptist Church, Reedy Chapel, African American. I did the same thing you did.
Yeah.
African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes. And Galveston was really the economic center, the engine of the South. It was the New York of the South. So this was where it was. Galveston was it. Houston was a swamp during this period of time. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it eventually outgrew Galveston because they had the land base. They could do that. Galveston is restricted. And we also get to clean up and rebuild every time a hurricane comes.
Yes.
So 1900 set us back. But yes, Galveston was the economic engine of the South. If there was cotton and cotton was king, cotton had to come to Galveston to be shipped out from this deep water port to other places around the world.
I tell you, again, even when we talk about education,
yes,
in Galveston, everybody who was African American came far and near to go to
high school here, because Galveston, of course, as you know, had the first high school established for African Americans in the state of Texas, Central High School. What a legacy that is. What a legacy that is. And you, of course, are a graduate of Central High School. I came along after you. Mm-hmm. And by the time I graduated from high school, they had integrated the high schools and completely integrated the high schools. And then I graduated from Ball High School. I know all the words to the school song for Central High School. I can't remember the first word. It's because we loved our Central High School.
Yes.
All the little girls on our block, we would know all the cheers. We were doing all the Bearcat cheers. We knew all of that. And so we lost a lot of that heritage. I mean, when I say we,
yes,
we who did not get a chance to go to Central High School. However, my graduating class of 1969 was
Yes.
the first
yes,
fully integrated graduating class of Galveston in its history since 1839.
yes, yes. And
And so that is historic in itself.
it's historic in itself. It really is. Another thing that we've had persons to call Galveston to find out about Juneteenth, about the foods that we eat during that time. But of course, the foods that we eat are historical things that some are, from what I keep looking at recipes, African foods.
The first food that comes to mind is the African plum.
Yes.
The African plum, you know what that is?
The watermelon.
That's the watermelon.
Yeah.
And it's the color red.
Yes.
It's the color red. It's the color of freedom. And so there are a lot of red foods associated with the foods of Juneteenth. Red soda water,
Yes.
watermelon, strawberries. So yes, we have a real history of red foods, and of course, a deep history of barbecuing various different types of meat in various different ways.
Yes. I'm just trying to think of things that we keep getting calls about, to make sure that everyone understands. We're excited about the country celebrating and having that time for everyone who are African Americans to celebrate who they are.
And you know what? I view Juneteenth as an American
Yes.
holiday. Of course, we want people of African descent we expect that they will celebrate their own emancipation. But the emancipation of enslaved people in this country moved this country closer to its founding principles. All men are created equal. Had it not been for the fact that black people were freed in this country, we would be real far away from those founding principles. And so freedom is a reason for everybody to celebrate. And now that it is a federal holiday, it should be celebrated by everyone. It should be as significant a holiday in this country as the 4th of July. Mm-hmm. And so I want everybody to say, Happy Juneteenth. That Al Edwards says that. He says, tell somebody,
Yes.
Happy Juneteenth. And that is true for everyone.
I was just, when you said that about the federal holiday, can you back up and explain that it had become a Texas holiday
First.
first?
It was Texas was the first state to have a state holiday for Juneteenth. And that was under the hard and long work of State Representative Al Edwards, the late Al Edwards. And I think it's fitting that that Texas should be the first state to celebrate emancipation, since it was the last state to enforce it.
Yeah.
But subsequently, other states throughout the country, one by one, started to enact legislation for the celebration of Juneteenth be a holiday. And of course, we know that Texas's own Miss Opal Lee was a pioneer and she carried this banner across the country for years as a 90-year-old woman walking throughout the country 2.5 miles in every city for those 2.5 years that we had to wait for emancipation. She walked that and brought attention to the fact that Juneteenth should be a federal holiday. And it was, of course, became a federal holiday in 2021, and Joe Biden signed it into law and gave the pen to Miss Opal Lee.
Wow. We're looking forward to folk who are interested in learning the history to come to Galveston.
Please come to Galveston.
Come to Galveston, where it all began.
Where it all began.
And we look forward to all of the different means of us putting out the history so that it's not the first time, but for the rest of everyone's life, that they know what the history of Juneteenth in the city of Galveston Island, Texas.
Tell the stories. Repeat the stories. Make sure everybody knows it. And eventually it will be something that everybody in the country knows, if we can get past people who are still making monumental efforts to edit and redact the history of this country. That's a very powerful movement that's going on right now. Removing textbooks, removing scholarly works that tell the true and complete history of Texas, and even challenging the Texas State Historical Association on the grounds that including all this history that's not so, let's say, attractive to the image of Texas, including that is detrimental to Texas. No, it's detrimental to leave out the history of the people, all the people who made up this. Tell the truth of history. History is. Don't redact it. Don't edit it. Don't sweeten it to benefit one point of view. Tell the truth of history.
Wow. Reedy has also had many people come to that service to actually see the church, to listen. We've even had people to reenact.
Yes, we try to make an educational experience out of it every year. So we've had story quilters, we've had historical reenactors, we have special guests, we have speakers. And in fact, for the 2023, this year's Juneteenth celebration at Reedy Chapel, one of our special guests is going to be a descendant of Hawkins Wilson, that gentleman that we talked about, who was so famous for the letter that he wrote in the Freedmen's Bureau. We have a descendant who lives in Houston, because eventually Hawkins Wilson left Galveston and established his life in Houston as a minister. Wow. And his descendant lives there. And in fact, Henry Louis Gates did a documentary about the family and how they reconnected some of the family using DNA. They reconnected some of his descendants with other family members in Virginia. And we are very excited to have her come and be a part of our celebration this year. And our celebration is going to include a family fun day, because we want to make sure we have a lot of children around to learn about the history, to see that historic Emancipation March, and to participate in it, and to see the pride that we take in our church and in our history. And our history is spectacular, but so is our edifice. Mm-hmm. Our church is on the National Register of Historic Places, which is very rare for black churches. They might be spectacular, but they're not registered. They're not on the National Register. So it's a national architectural treasure. So to see the church itself, it's spectacular inside. The architecture is unbelievable. And then to know the history that is associated with the church just enhances the experience. Reedy Chapel has gone through everything that Galveston has gone through. One of the first edifices was burned in the Great Galveston Fire in 1885, when fire swept from Harborside 30 blocks inland and took out Reedy Chapel. And within a year, our church was rebuilt. How in the world? What? That happened. And so we have so many things to be proud of. You just have to look at the cornerstones and the plaques on the front of the building to know this church has some history. Norris Wright Cuny laid the cornerstone to the church.
Yes.
He was funeralized in that church.
I tell you, we are just so excited to have you as a genealogist to help us continue to study about Juneteenth and to make it known and relevant to the Galveston community, as well as to the future of our country, our children. And we look forward to many more reenactments. I notice that every time we get a new minister, they get so excited until they are extremely happy to be the shepherd of that church.
And that pride, they should carry that with pride, because now they become a part of the history.
Yes.
As members of the church.
Yes.
We become a part. We are a part.
Yes.
Of the history of this institution that has lasted all these many years. And we are still praising God and thanking him for all of his blessings. And he's still keeping us moving forward one step at a time.
Well, we certainly look forward to anyone who's listening. Come on down.
Come on down.
Celebrate
with us where it all began. And I get calls regularly from all over the country now, because the word is getting out. A lot of people did not know that Juneteenth started in Galveston, that it is the home of Galveston. Juneteenth. Galveston is the home of Juneteenth. But now the word is getting out. So we regularly get calls about it. And I'm sure your podcast is going to generate more interest throughout the country.
Well, what else is exciting is that, being brought up in Galveston.
Yes.
And you know that you're on an island.
Yes.
But when you go away somewhere else, everyone goes, an island?
An island?
In Texas?
Right.
And so I have made it a point to explain that we are 32 miles long and 3 miles wide and in the Gulf of Mexico, bordered by the Gulf of Mexico and the Galveston Bay. And it is just exciting. I even laugh about, we have island talk. We go down the island, we're BOIs, IBCs. So, again, we look forward.
Sand between your toes.
Yes, sand between your toes. In fact, we all come back.
This is true.
We all come back.
There's something.
You and I both were in California and came back. And so I'm just excited that we could do this in order to keep our history alive.
Yes. Tell the stories.
Tell the story.
And as a genealogist, I always have to put a plug in. Find out about your own family.
Yeah.
Research your own family, because it's likely that if your family was here in the 1860s, if they were enslaved here in the 1850s and 60s, they probably took that Emancipation March, that
Yes.
first Emancipation March,
Yes.
from the old Galveston Courthouse to the Colored Church on Broadway. Your family could be a part of the original celebration of emancipation, but you got to discover that by researching your own family.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.